Good evening. Thank you all for being here tonight at this event sponsored by the Center for Politics and the People at Ripon College, the Center for Diversity and Inclusion, and the League of Women Voters of the Ripon area. I am Henrik Schatzinger, director of the center, and I'm also a professor of political science. What makes these events special is not only your attendance, but also your active participation. And you will have an opportunity to ask questions later in the program. To those of you who are visiting Ripon College, welcome. We are happy to have you here tonight. I would also like to welcome our viewers who are joining us via Wisconsin Eye. This is our first live-streamed event by WisEye from Ripon's campus, and we are thrilled to be their partners. I also want to thank Clearview Productions in making this event possible. Today, we are very fortunate to welcome Kat Griffith, who resides in Ripon and who is a Fond du Lac County Board Supervisor and also a leader in our community. Kat will give a presentation titled Asylum and the Changing Face of Immigration. It is an issue that has been at the forefront of social and political discourse here in Wisconsin, but also throughout the nation. Surveys this year have identified immigration as the most important non-economic problem. At the same time, asylum and immigration are highly polarizing topics. It is therefore an excellent issue for us to address because it challenges us to think about how we can advance civil discourse, and I want to highlight the word civil, when we talk about this issue, which is at the core of the center's mission. Kat Griffith has decades of experience working with refugees. In her presentation, she will use various statistics and figures to break down misconceptions concerning the state at the southern border and the asylum seeking process. Photographs will help tell the story of the migrant camp she has visited that holds non-citizens awaiting court proceedings. Her interest in immigration policy and asylum began in Boston in the 1980s, when she translated written statements from Salvadoran refugees fleeing the Civil War. After moving to Ripon, she interpreted and advocated for Mexican and Central American immigrants for a decade. Her involvement has led her to spend time at a border camp and witness a deportation flight. After the presentation, as I said, there will be time for questions and answers. And without further ado, and also on behalf of the Center for Diversity and Inclusion and the League of Women Voters of the Ripon area, please join me in welcoming Kat Griffith.
Thank you so much, Henrik. I really appreciate your introduction, and thank you so much to all of you for coming out tonight. I'm really excited to be here. I've given this talk, versions of this talk, many times all over this area, all the way to Sheboygan and Madison and yeah, all over. I'm really thrilled to be doing it here at home. So what we're going to cover today is I'm going to start off with some definitions. A lot of people don't really know the definitions of migrant, immigrant, refugee, and asylum seeker, so I want to get that clear right from the start. Then I'm going to do a kind of a data dump, a few slides showing data on migration and border security since 1992. This will probably challenge a lot of what a lot of us think we know. Then I'm going to shift gears and focus on some stories of individual people. These are asylum seekers that I have met and in a number of cases worked with, taking their statements, translating them into English. Then we're going to take a brief tour of a border camp, a tent court, and a deportation flight. And then I'm going to update us, kind of a whirlwind update of recent immigration trends and policies. This is actually really difficult because we went a long period of time with one story being the story. And then about 8 months ago, a lot of things changed. So I'm trying to not overwhelm the presentation with the last 8 months. It would be easy to do. And then I'm going to end with some thoughts about a better national conversation about immigration. So here we go. So a migrant is someone who is on the move, seeking a new place to live. If they're in a caravan walking across Mexico, if they're in a border camp, they're a migrant. An immigrant is someone who's become a resident in another country and who intends to remain. A refugee has a very specific legal definition. It's someone who has had to flee their home for reasons of violence or persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. They must generally obtain formal refugee status, going through pretty stringent vetting before they're allowed to come to the United States. An asylum seeker is someone who may qualify for refugee status, but they seek to obtain it upon or after arriving in the United States. Until recently, this was actually the only possible method for many people. I won't get into that now, but there is a difference. Asylum seekers are people who could qualify, perhaps, for refugee status, and they're asking to pursue that. So this first graph shows you Border Patrol staffing from 1992 through 2020. This comes from Customs and Border Protection data. If you followed that line out through 2023, it would go up a little bit higher. It would go up to about the current peak, the highest point. And then if you went out to 2024, it goes up kind of off the chart there. So the first thing I want you to notice is that staffing has gone up steadily since 1992 under both Republican and Democratic administrations. It peaked under Obama, it came down a little bit under Trump, it's reached a new peak under Biden, and it's fair to say, if you look at this, there isn't an obvious pattern other than it keeps on going up. There's no party that does one thing and then the other party does the other thing. Increasing the number of boots on the ground at the border has been a bipartisan project over many, many years. The two parties' rhetoric may differ, but not their action on the ground in this matter. This is the cost of border security and immigration enforcement in the United States. As you can see, that too goes pretty steadily up. In 1990, we spent about $263 million on border security. In 2021, we spent almost $5 billion. If you adjust that for inflation, we are spending 8 times more now than we were then. It's worth asking, and I'm going to say a little bit more. In the appropriations bill that Biden signed in March, we added $1.7 billion to the pot, with most of that money going to border enforcement and detention. So we are now, if you were to continue this graph out, it would go significantly higher. It's also worth mentioning that the cost per apprehension has gone way up. In the year 2000, it cost about $656 per apprehension. In 2018, it was $11,000 per apprehension. Now, those numbers are not inflation adjusted, but a rough estimate would be that we're spending about 10 times more per apprehension, well, we were in 2018, than we are now. Now, since then, the numbers of apprehensions have yo-yoed around, the money we're spending keeps on going up. I don't know what the figures are right now. But it's worth asking, how much are we willing to spend to keep one more person out? This next slide is apprehensions at the US-Mexico border. The first thing to say is that this line is not a neat inverse of the previous two. If throwing more money and boots at the ground would bring down the numbers of apprehensions, we'd see a smooth downward slope, but we don't see that. The second thing is that there's no consistent pattern here based on which party is in the White House. The third thing is that the president, in fact, has fairly limited power. Both Trump and Biden have had executive actions that were tied up in court. It's Congress that controls the purse strings, not the president, and Congress has failed to pass an immigration reform. Nobody controls the dictators in Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. And in fact, I think that most of our presidents generally deserve only at most modest credit or blame for how many apprehensions there are at the border. The president just doesn't have, it's a very complex system. Many causes, many variables. The president only controls a few. If you look at this graph, you'll also notice that the lowest point in apprehensions was actually under the Obama administration. That's over here. And it's true that he also spent a lot on border protection, and he deported a lot of people, but the biggest driver there was the economy. The economy tanked in the recession, and more people left. About 1 million more migrants left the United States than came in over that period. It didn't have that much to do with immigration policy. The recent surge started under Trump, and it continued under Biden. What I'd like to do is clarify the 4 factors that drive these numbers. So the first one is simply how many people try to cross, duh. The second one is how many times they each try. The third is how hard they're trying to evade capture and detection. And the fourth is how hard we're trying to stop them. It turns out that we only fully control one of those things, how hard we're trying to stop them. Right? That's not what you'd think from listening to the debate, but the other variables actually matter quite a bit. So for example, conditions in sending countries that cause more people to want to come, or fewer, are largely beyond our control, and they play a huge role in how many people decide to try crossing the border. In terms of how many tries they each make, during the pandemic, under Title 42, we took away the punishments for people who tried more than once. And that meant that many people tried multiple times. So the numbers of apprehensions seemed to be skyrocketing, but that didn't fully reflect the number of people who were at the border. The number of people was not as great as the number of attempts. So it was kind of a misleading number. And then the final one that takes some explanation is how hard migrants are trying to evade capture. So until recently, many migrants arriving at the border seeking to claim asylum would turn themselves in to Customs and Border Protection as soon as they crossed the border. They would practically throw themselves into the arms of Border Patrol because that was the way to ask for asylum. Your apprehension numbers will certainly go up very nicely if people are not trying to evade you. So that's one of the reasons that the numbers went up so high. And then this is also a graph that a lot of people don't know this. If you look at the beginning part over here, you'll see that 90% of the migrants back in 2019 were coming from Mexico and the 3 northernmost Central American countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. That was 90% of all the people showing up at our border. It is not like that now. Now it is 50% coming from there. And all of a sudden, we have a big group coming from South America, especially Venezuela, but other countries as well. We also have a chunk coming from other Central American countries. And we've got people coming from Asia and other countries in the world. So now, we've got people coming from Venezuela, Haiti, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Cuba, China, Turkey, Russia, India, and other countries, significant numbers. Those are the top countries, right? We can't simply deport people back to all of those countries. It's not as simple as when they came from Mexico. We send them back to Mexico, right over the border and they're home. If somebody comes from Haiti, are we going to deport them back to Haiti right now? Are we going to deport people back to Russia right now if they fear for their lives? Some of these countries we don't have normal diplomatic relations with. Some of them won't accept deportees from us. We can't just send them back, and we can't just dump them on other countries. We can only do that with permission. So we have all these people that it's not as easy as just shipping them back across the border to Mexico. So we really need to understand that this changing migration pattern, this changing demographic, has really complicated what our policies need to do and what options are open to us. So I want to just list here some recent multiple historic highs. One of them is arrivals and apprehensions. One of them is resources devoted to Border Patrol. One of them is women and children and families. And this matters because policies like detention, which we do a lot of, feel very, very different to a lot of people when so many of the detainees are women and children rather than single men. Another recent high is the number of sending countries and reasons to flee. Wars, dictatorships, climate disasters, failed states. More people are on the move around the world right now than at any time since the end of World War II. We need updated policies that better fit these realities. Another all-time high is migrant detentions. Though not as a percentage of people entering, we now have over 41,000 detention beds. They are full. Another high is migrants seeking asylum. Up through 2023, they weren't trying to evade detection. They were turning themselves in. And really, if you think about it, when people cross the border in large numbers, turning themselves in to Border Patrol and seeking protection, this is not a law enforcement issue. This is a humanitarian crisis. So we can't just think of it in terms of, what do we do to police the border? They're handing themselves over. There have been times in the last few years when Customs and Border Patrol was so busy caring for the people in their custody that they did not have the resources to man the border, and they had to shut it down. That's a whole different kind of problem than we've seen, and it's not an easy one to solve. Another all-time high is releases to pursue asylum. Now, for the reasons I mentioned, we can't just deport all these people back to the countries they came from or anywhere else, nor would we want to in many cases. The releases to pursue asylum started to surge under President Trump, and he actually did give about 25% of the people seeking asylum the right to try for it. He gave them a chance to try for it. So he did it too because he had to. That was the way our law is. The surge has continued under Trump and grew much greater until his recent executive orders, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So we don't have detention space for all of them. We can't deport them back to countries that won't take them. We can't lawfully expel them if they can pass a credible threat interview. So until recently, many have been let into the country to pursue their asylum claim. Some are given alternatives to detention. They may get an ankle bracelet. They're all assigned a future appointment with immigration officials. And at least some of them surrender their passports to immigration officials to ensure that they show up for their appointment for their asylum case. And most of them do show up. So there's now a historic backlog of asylum cases. There are 1.6 million pending as of January, with wait times of about 4 years. People who are being given the chance to apply for asylum now have wait times of about 5 years. And this actually has had a significant impact on people coming to the border, because what people realize is that if I get let in to pursue my case, I'm going to get 4 years there while they decide it. Even if I don't have a really strong case, even if I might not make it, I might get 4 years. So for a time, that was a really powerful motivator. The fact that we were not clearing our backlog and we were not devoting sufficient resources to the court system that we have meant that more people were motivated to come. So it was kind of a cycle. And finally, resources devoted to Border Patrol and detention are now at an all-time high, especially since the appropriations bill that President Biden signed in March. He finally got some of what he's been long asking for, though less than the bipartisan border bill would have allocated. The appropriations bill mostly funds detention and border security. Only small amounts are going to the backlog of asylum applications, cities resettling migrants, and alternatives to detention. So in addition to these multiple historic highs that particularly the Biden administration has kind of had land in its inbox, there are also several historic constraints that have not always existed. One of them is that, as I've mentioned, many migrants truly do qualify for protection under our laws. We have laws that we have to follow, and they come from countries that we can't easily send them back to. Another issue is that our domestic policy is particularly dysfunctional right now. The bipartisan bill, border bill, which would have included funding for agents, courts, asylum officers, detention, fentanyl detection, more visas, more assistance to cities resettling migrants, all of these things, that bill very nearly made it into law. It had enough votes for a while, and then it was killed. And then we also have a new foe: lucrative, sophisticated, transnational smuggling rings selling lies and hope. They are highly motivated to do this. It is a very big business. It's not just sort of this casual, some guy in Mexico will help walk you across the border and give you a sandwich. It's a different enterprise right now, and they're highly motivated to sell lies and sell hope, and it's very difficult to combat that. So they are recruiting migrants all the time. So that was a lot of lists and statistics. I want to put some faces and humanity into these numbers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the people that I met in Matamoros at a migrant camp there, and also some people that I have known locally. So this first story, and by the way, all of these people gave me permission to share their stories. Not all of them gave me permission to share their names or photographs. So this woman here, who I think you'll agree has a very determined look, she was quite an impressive woman. She was a police officer, and she was fleeing El Salvador because of repeated threats from gangs. She was separated from her husband and daughter during their flight from El Salvador. Her husband and daughter got across the border, she did not. Now I want to say a little bit about what she was doing. As a police officer, El Salvador has a very, very high rate of gang violence and criminality, and she was going after gangs. I assume she was a good one because then the gangs started going after her. The first time they threatened her, she and her husband moved to a new neighborhood. The same thing happened again. She made enemies among the local gangs. They threatened her again. They moved again. The third time, not only the gangs threatened them, so did their friends, because the gangs were threatening their friends. And they realized at that point, this is untenable, we can't stay here. So they fled. She and her son had been in Matamoros in the camp for nearly a year, trying to rejoin her husband and daughter in the United States, who had gotten through to seek their asylum applications. So I'm going to do a short detour here. Why are there gangs in El Salvador? A lot of people don't know this. Because so many seekers of asylum from Central America are fleeing gang violence, I want to tell this story. Scholars trace the problem of gangs in El Salvador back to the Salvadoran Civil War, in which thousands of young men fleeing forced conscription on both sides wound up seeking asylum in the United States. I had a volunteer job in the 1980s translating affidavits from Salvadoran asylum seekers. So I heard all about what they were running from. Only 4% of the migrants fleeing El Salvador were ultimately granted asylum in the United States. The rest struggled to establish themselves. They were here undocumented, unable to get legal status. According to researchers, some who were living on the streets of LA, because they had nowhere else to go, were being preyed upon by existing gangs. Some of them banded together for self-protection. It started off as an informal self-protective measure, but they eventually, some of them wound up in prison, and that's where they met hardened gang members and became hardened gang members themselves. When their terms were up, we deported them back to El Salvador. At the time, Central America had no gangs, but the cancer that was born in our own prisons among people who fled violence that our country paid for, whose asylum claims we denied, metastasized into a transnational criminal enterprise. The gangs quickly took over large parts of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, the infamous Northern Triangle. And now we are reaping what we sowed, a third-generation ripple effect of our decisions during the 1980s. The families fleeing gang violence in Central America are showing up at our border, again seeking asylum in the very country that many of us believe bears some responsibility for their plight. Next, a Honduran story. This was another man that I met in Matamoros in the migrant camp. He also was fleeing gang violence, and he also was separated from his wife and son during their flight from Honduras. He also had the misfortune to be kidnapped from the border while he was there, and he and his daughter were put in a warehouse. They were held there for a week while the kidnappers tried to arrange payments, and I believe their families in Honduras were shaken down and ended up paying their ransom. But unfortunately, while they were held by the kidnappers, they missed their ICE appointment, and the judge canceled their asylum application. So he was trying over again. He had to start anew and hope that some judge would be understanding about what had happened. In the interest of time, I'm going to tell just one of these stories. I'm going to tell about the girl in the yellow shirt. She's somebody I came to know very well. Her story was that she left for school one morning. She was 12 years old. A young guy approached her and pointed to another guy across the street and said, he wants you to be his girlfriend. He made it clear she better say yes. Now, like many young men in the neighborhood, they were gang involved. She didn't dare show her terror by returning home after that invitation. She continued on to school and told the principal what had happened. The principal called her mother, and her mother said, "Don't come home after school, I'm gonna go get you." So her mother showed up after school, took her to a place across town, and at dawn the next morning, they boarded a bus and headed north. When they got to the border, they were separated. This was in 2018 during the family separation policy. So the girl was sent to one detention center, and her mother was sent to another. 3 weeks later, some agents went to the mother and said, "If you will sign these papers and promise never to cross the border again, we will reunite you with your daughter and deport you back to your home country. Will you sign these papers? Do you accept that?" And she said, "Yes, I do." So she signed the papers. They took her to the airport. No daughter. They lied. They deported her alone back to El Salvador. Oops, yeah. So she went back there, and then her daughter knocked around in foster care for 2 years after that, from a couple of different homes. Eventually wound up staying with a close friend of mine. And because it was possible to reach her parents, it often isn't, there were some hardworking advocates who managed to arrange eventually for her parents to be given permission to temporarily join her here because they had been treated so badly. There was clear evidence that they had been lied to and treated badly. So her parents ended up joining her here, and they were reunited after 4 years apart. I have to say, when you separate a child from their parents at the age of 12 and bring them back together at 16, it's not a fairy tale ending. Everybody is traumatized. It's been a struggle, and they still don't have any clear asylum. We don't know what's going to happen. None of them have long-term residency or anything like that. The case is still in process, and there are no guarantees. I'm going to skip the other story for the moment. And then I'm going to tell you one more here. This is a kind of unusual story in that the man that you see there, his name is Omar, is the older brother of a boy who was adopted by a Wisconsin family. The adoptive family and the birth family stayed in touch for 25 years until the events that I'm about to describe. So the story started when Omar's 2 younger brothers went out to buy a soccer ball and never returned. Their disappearance was reported, but nothing was done. After a social media post from the mom asking if anyone knew anything about their whereabouts, Omar's mother started receiving threatening calls demanding ransom. She paid the first demand, which cleaned her out. It was almost $1,000, which was a lot for her. And then she immediately, as soon as she paid up, she got another demand. The callers sent her pictures of headless, tortured bodies. They sent her threats. And again, the police did nothing. It became clear she couldn't pay another ransom. Eventually, they sort of the ransom seekers drifted off, but the police did nothing. 2 weeks later, the bodies of the boys were discovered. They were tortured, mutilated, and in cardboard boxes in a ravine in Guatemala City. A few days later, a man claiming to be a police investigator on the case did an in-depth interview with Omar. They talked for, an hour. 2 days later, the whole story with all the identifying details, including the interview, which had been surreptitiously recorded, was posted on multiple social media sites. It turned out he wasn't a police investigator, he was a lying journalist. Omar begged him to take down the posts, but he refused. I'm leaving out a lot of details here, but repeated visits to the police netted no protection and no action. Things came to a head when Omar's father was driving through the city, and he was stopped by a carload of young men who told him that the family better call off their demands for an investigation or else. They made it clear that they knew who his older son was, where he lived, what his license plate was, and they said, "We're going after him if you don't call off the investigation." So a couple of housebound and sleepless weeks later, Omar and his wife decided that they needed to leave Guatemala and try to come to the United States. The adoptive family of Omar's younger brother arranged and paid for their trip, found them housing, hired a lawyer, and with a whole series of very bits of good luck, including getting some of the last safe conduct visas across Mexico, 6 weeks later, they crossed the border legally with a scheduled appointment with using the Customs and Border Patrol app, which allows you to set up an appointment for an asylum hearing. The app has very limited numbers of appointments. For a long time, it was really glitchy, and they only give a very limited number of appointments per day. So it was very lucky that they ended up getting to cross the border in about 6 weeks. They're now living in Wisconsin, awaiting the resolution of their case, which will take about 4 years. Omar is now working legally and mostly managing to support his family after waiting the required 6 months for a work permit. Their case is unusual in several ways, not least because of their financial backing and some really good luck. Also, there was an extensive paper and media trail about what happened, which most people don't have. That strengthened their asylum case, made it more likely that they could pass the credible threat interview. And they also have a strong community of people where they now live, helping them settle and navigate their new lives. That's an advantage that few people have. And I want to pause here for a moment and just give you a chance to digest these stories and honor those who've lived them with a moment of silence. Now I'm going to give you a very brief and partial tour of the migrant camp in Matamoros, Mexico, across from Brownsville, that I visited just before the pandemic. Although this particular camp no longer exists, I think there are several things that this story raises up that are still worth talking about. The first is the continuing human impacts of our immigration policies, which contribute to unnecessary suffering for so many people. Though there are still camps, though most of them are smaller, most of them are farther from the border, and most of them don't have anything like the resources or protection that the one I saw had. The second thing I'd like to raise up is the resilience and the courage and the can-do spirit of the migrants themselves. And the third is the existence of a lot of activists working hard to live out another version of our nation's ideals. I met dozens of church members and activists working from all over the country at the border. And despite the distressing results of a lot of our policies, they gave me some proud American moments. Maybe for some of you, as for me, they're kind of a ray of hope and a reminder that we're not helpless. So I and a couple of friends joined the Loose Association of Witness at the Border, which invited people to come down and see in action what the so-called migrant protection protocols looked like. So if you recall, migrant protection protocols, also known as the Remain in Mexico policy, was the policy in which asylum seekers would have to stay in Mexico for the duration of their asylum processing period. A tent court was set up just across the border in Brownsville, and the camp was where people stayed while they were waiting for their appointments. While neither the Mexican government nor the American government took responsibility for the conditions in the camp or tried to improve them, the camp was a direct outgrowth of official policy in both countries. Another part of our policy during this time was the Safe Third Country Agreements. So under US and international laws, it's illegal to send individuals back to a country where they face a realistic threat of harm. It is not illegal, however, to send them to another safe country that agrees to accept them. So what we did was we worked out agreements with the three major sending countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, to accept not their own, but other countries' migrants. We couldn't send Salvadorans back to El Salvador, but we could send them back to Honduras or Guatemala. So what we did was create an international merry-go-round of desperate migrants, deporting people back to any of three countries but their own. So the camp in Matamoros was about 2,500 people in an area about the size of Barlow Park. I want to say probably 15 or 20 acres or so. Many migrants spent more than a year in the camp. A couple of signs of resilience here that I'd like to point out. One is the vegetable garden. Up there, there's a little garden planted, and they even stuck a sign in it saying Honduran vegetables. This one is actually a washing machine drum, if you don't recognize what that is, from this town with our washing machine factory. That is a washing machine drum, and it is a great thing to have a fire in a tent camp. You can imagine open fires surrounded by tents, bad idea. This was a way to contain fires. So many people cooked over fires in these drums. They also made a lot of their own furniture. They also ran the trash collection in the camp. They would say, okay, Hondurans, take out the trash on Tuesday. Salvadorans, take out the trash on Wednesday. They organized these things. They even worked to organize a sidewalk school for the kids. Now, I'm not gonna lie, it was minimal. It was about an hour and a half a day, 3 days a week. And a couple dozen kids chose to attend it. It was staffed by mostly Cuban professionals, a doctor, a couple teachers. They were highly educated and motivated, and there was a fundraising effort to try to pay them for their work since they were doing professional work. But there was a lot of really impressive organization in the camp. There was also quite remarkable services and infrastructure, considering that it was all done by volunteers and donations. So you can see that Doctors Without Borders had psychological attention. They had a therapist there. They had that little stand there is a homemade cell phone charger. And then the building that you see is the Resource Center of Matamoros. That place was a beehive of activity. They did everything. They had legal aid, they had photocopy machines, they gave out tents and cots and food and diapers and personal hygiene products. Whatever you needed, they probably had it. Or they could help find somebody who did. And that was where many, many volunteers cycled through doing translating and paperwork and all kinds of advocacy stuff. They also had a UNICEF Children's Center, and they had a World Central Kitchen, which served 5,000 meals per day, all on volunteers and donations. There was a free clinic. Several international organizations sent staff and facilities for that. The guy in the red shirt is a Cuban doctor. They hired him immediately to do his job. They had volunteer and paid staff at this at this clinic. The showers were tent showers. The water filtration system was the only water they had. There was no other source of water in the camp. They were right by the Rio Grande, which eventually flooded and washed the camp away, but this was their water filtration system for quite a while. And then there were volunteers and activists. I was there for 5 days, and there was a continuous flow-through of church and civic groups and activists. The protest that you see there on the lower picture across the street from the tent court went on every day for months. Volunteers and private donations covered everything from the water filtration and the phone charging to the meals. The only camp infrastructure that came from the Mexican government was the perimeter fencing, and there was nothing from the US government. For me, there was hope and inspiration in the sheer range of people who came down to volunteer. Presbyterians and Methodists and Catholics and Jews and Quakers and every other denomination you can think of, as well as civic and advocacy groups. Their commitment to helping out and seeing reality with open eyes and bringing their experience home gave me some proud moments. This is a picture of the tent courts, which were directly across the international border from Matamoros. So the way this worked was people who crossed the border illegally to seek asylum were immediately placed in removal proceedings, but they could seek asylum as part of that. It was kind of like, no, I object, I have a reason to be here. And they had 3 appointments. The first 2 were group appointments. At the first one, a judge would explain the process, hand out all the paperwork, and the State Department report on the conditions in their home country. All the printed materials were in English. At the second appointment, usually about 3 months later, they would hand in their application and any supporting documentation. If the application was incomplete or incorrect, it would be handed back, often with no explanation, and they could try again a few months later. In the group of 25 people that we witnessed, 2 had lawyers, the rest were on their own. At their third appointment, they would have about 15 to 20 minutes with a judge who would decide their case on the spot. The whole process generally took 9 to 12 months if everything went right. Vanishingly few would ultimately be granted asylum. This was a deportation flight that I sort of witnessed. These happened several times a week. This one was going to Guatemala. We were told ahead of time that they would try to prevent us from seeing anything by parking trucks in front of us, and that is the way it was. In the first picture down here, the plane had just rolled in. You can see the nose of the plane here, and they immediately drove a tanker truck out and parked it in front of it. Then a bus came in full of migrants, and they parked a second truck in front of that, so we couldn't see the bus. So we moved to a further vantage point where we could see under the trucks and under the belly of the plane, and we watched them shackle the migrants before they got on the plane. For me, honestly, the disturbing thing was that our government tried so hard to hide these deportation flights from its own citizens. If we had been able to see them, I don't think we would have seen anything that we didn't know was happening. But the fact that they were hiding it from us and that that was such a deliberate effort on their part, I found disturbing. So now I'm going to fast forward to early 2024. Basically, we were at an all-time high of 250,000 apprehensions at the border in December of 2023. There were nearly 10,000 people a day coming to the border some of the days in December 2023. That is a crisis by any measure. I don't disagree with people who say, this is a problem, we got to do something. Of 6 million who were apprehended since 2021, 1.7 million were released to seek asylum, just to give you a sense of the numbers over the last few years. And there's a current backlog of over 1 million asylum cases. Let's see. The recent surge, this kind of shows what it looked like over a period of time through the administrations of Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden. So it sort of angled down during Bush, reached a low under Obama, started back up again under Trump, and soared under Biden. But you need to understand that the 2020 numbers and on 2020 and after include apprehensions and expulsions combined. The prior figures only apprehensions. So it's a little bit counting apples and oranges, but this is the way the data are available. So as I explained earlier, this was a humanitarian crisis with multiple drivers, and there was no way we could ultimately process that many people. The Biden administration made a big investment, politically and otherwise, in the bipartisan border bill. It had the votes to pass, but ultimately Senate Republicans killed it in February, so he needed to rely on executive orders to address the problem. I'm going to talk about what those orders are in a moment, but first I want to show you the results. So this is a graph of Border Patrol releases of migrants. It's not quite the same as the other graphs. It's not illegal border crossings, but I will tell you that those are down by 80% since December of 2023. They're currently at their lowest level in 4 years. This graph shows permissions to enter the country to seek asylum. You can see that this is the peak in December, and then down here in July. And the number in August was in July was 1/16 the number in December. That is a very large reduction in the number of people allowed in to seek asylum. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's a very large reduction. Also, according to the Department of Homeland Security, we removed more people in the last year, almost 750,000, than in any previous year since 2010. And I want to linger here a moment on these numbers because there are people claiming that right now there are millions of people streaming across an open border. That is not true. Illegal border crossings are currently similar to where they were before Biden took office. Permissions to enter the country and seek asylum are way down. And recall that even under the previous administration, by law, many people were let in to seek asylum. And removals are way up. According to NPR, by one measure, the Biden administration's nearly 4.4 million repatriations are already more than any single presidential term since George W. Bush's second term. So whatever you think of Biden's executive orders, they have been effective in reducing the flow of people to and through our southern border. So what are these orders trying to do? In the interest of time, I'm going to be very brief here, but there is more to say if you choose to bring more into the Q&A. First, his executive orders have established ways for people to seek asylum or humanitarian parole without showing up at the southern border. So, for example, there are now new safe mobility offices in 4 countries, Guatemala, Colombia, Ecuador, and Costa Rica. Migrants can make their claims and be vetted there, and they are vetted. It's a serious process. They can also seek other lawful ways of entering at those points. They can seek refugee status or agricultural or unskilled worker visas if there are any available. The executive orders have also expanded humanitarian parole for migrants coming from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And those countries that have the safe mobility offices, they are strategically located to be accessible to people coming from these countries. So they really are an option that did not exist before. These migrants must have a sponsor. I think that's a very useful thing, that they have to have proof of somebody who's willing to help support them financially. And they have to go through the pretty stringent vetting to come through. It's similar to what you do for refugee status. And if they go through all that process, they can come in on commercial flights. They don't have to go to the border at all. So you're reducing tremendously the pressure on the border. Now, there are not enough slots for all the people who would like to get those humanitarian slots, but there are a lot more of them than there used to be in an orderly fashion. So I think there's a lot to recommend this particular policy. Second, we've eased the extreme shortage of judges by training and empowering asylum officers to adjudicate cases. So we've hired people to just do that. And that's speeding up the processing quite a bit, which, as we saw, is an important way of reducing the motivation to come. If you think you're going to get 4 years here, whether or not your asylum claim succeeds, you're going to be motivated to come. If we can bring that asylum processing claim time down, that becomes less attractive. Oh, I also mentioned that under the expanded humanitarian parole from those 4 countries, in the last 18 months, over 500,000 have entered through that program. So it actually is a real motivation to try that out. Enough people are getting it that it's a true alternative. A third thing that we've done is we've made it harder to claim asylum at the border. The asylum system is now basically closed to those who enter between ports of entry. If you enter illegally at this point, you're not likely to be given a chance to apply for asylum. Now you have to either go through one of the safe mobility offices, or you have to request an appointment at one of the ports of entry using the CBP-1 app, which is the app that allows you to make an appointment for an asylum hearing. Those are very tightly controlled in terms of numbers, so the demand is always much greater than the number of appointments, and that's why there are still migrant camps, people waiting to get an appointment through CBP-1. But one of the things that we changed is that now that app works all the way down to southern Mexico. So now there are migrant camps all over Mexico. Being so far from the border, they are much less well-resourced. They're smaller, they're more ephemeral, they're more miserable, but they still exist. We have also raised the credible threat threshold for seeking asylum. It used to be that if you had some sort of a case, like, yeah, that sounds plausible, yeah, you might make it, you might be let in. Now, you pretty much are only going to be let in to try if it seems like you've got a really good shot. We're making it almost as hard to get in to try as it will be to ultimately get asylum. That's a different way of doing it. I think people can reasonably disagree about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but we've made it a lot harder. So we've also established some collaborations with other governments, including Mexico and Panama, where we're actively working to reduce the number of migrants who wind up at our southern border. So, for example, over 500,000, mostly Venezuelans, crossed the Darien Gap from Colombia to Panama last year. That is a hellacious trek. It's very, very dangerous. Many people die. Our efforts with Panama have not borne a great deal of fruit, I will say. That's not one of the more successful ones. But The 30,000 Mexican soldiers that are now patrolling Mexico's border, newly patrolling Mexico's border, have prevented a lot of people from coming north to the border. There are a lot of reports of human rights violations as well. This is not all good news, but it's definitely keeping people from getting to our southern border. And finally, there's a shut-off valve. If the system becomes overwhelmed, if the number of people seeking entry at the border gets too high, the whole system just shuts down, and it stays shut down until the numbers go down. And Biden has recently sought to have that shutdown last longer. I don't know. I think there's a lot to be said about those policies, whether they're good or bad, but they're what Biden could do. They have been remarkably effective in reducing the number of people coming to and going through the border. And then the question is, where do we go from here? I'm here because it's my hope that a better national conversation could eventually lead to better policies. Having given versions of this presentation to quite mixed audiences and gotten a warm response from a wide range of people, I'm hopeful that real data and real people, the stories of real people, can help us find our way to a more productive policy. So what I mean by a better conversation is one that first starts with our values and our goals and our concerns. Even people with very different political leanings, and I know this from canvassing on people's doorsteps for my own office on the county board and also other canvassing I've done, a lot of us want fundamentally the same things. I also, as most of you, want a controlled and orderly border. I want the rule of law. I want domestic safety and prosperity. I want us to be a country of freedom, democracy, and opportunity. I don't know many people who don't want these things, and I think that's where we need to start our conversations, to establish those ground values that we can agree on. A better conversation also needs to recognize that both parties got us to where we are today. What we do at the border is very bipartisan for the most part. Most of what's happened there has been a bipartisan project. The bipartisan border bill, for all its flaws, was a true and hard-won compromise that had many useful provisions that cannot be achieved by executive orders or individual states. Those are not good replacements. It had something to cheer and outrage and disappoint everyone, which is probably as it should be. And I believe that this issue will continue to poison and toxify our politics until we pass a bipartisan bill. And the final thing I'll say is that a better conversation will address honestly today's facts on the ground, which are not addressed well by yesterday's policies. Circumstances have changed. We really are facing a different set of problems and a different set of opportunities. Migration worldwide is at a higher level than at any time since World War II. The political and economic and other realities that are causing such profound disruption require new thinking from us. There are some good ideas out there. We owe it to ourselves to consider them and to design an immigration system that will reflect both our humanitarian values and serve our enlightened self-interest. And I will end there.
Thank you very much, Kat. This was a highly informative presentation, and it's, I think, obvious to everyone how much research, but also your personal experience sort of went into it, so we're really grateful for that. With that being said, this is time for questions. I have a handheld microphone, and I will just go around and see who has a question. I have two requests. One would be to introduce yourself just real quick for us, and second, I hope you can keep your questions fairly short so we can get through more questions.
Surely there are some.
Who has a question? Yes, Laura.
Thank you. Laura DeGolier from Fond du Lac. I have a question for my nephew who wants to know if H-1B1 visas are they connected at all to the asylum seekers? Is that having any impact on those visas that are coming, where people come over on.
Are those visas for skilled workers?
Yes, right.
Generally
and
not
often
then.
high-tech,
Yeah, generally that would be outside of the asylum system.
totally
Yeah.
outside. Okay.
Yeah.
Next question.
Yes, I'm Gary Wetzel. Was the original asylum law, was that really intended to deal with people coming en masse or just people coming individually?
I don't know that it was, that the distinction would be individual versus en masse. I mean, I think a lot of war situations produce en masse refugee crises. And my understanding is that the system was designed to seek people fleeing more political or government carried out oppression and, discrimination and I don't think it was initially designed for things like gang violence. But the truth is that gang violence is one of the drivers of a lot of the immigration that we've seen. And you can make a case that if you're not a member of the right gang, you're in danger. And if you are a member of a gang, you're also in danger. But you can make a case that there is uncontrolled violence against people by virtue of a group they belong in, and I think it's ended up being used that way. But I don't think it was intended for gang violence. I think it was intended for state violence. And the reason that people seek asylum instead of refugee status, as I understand it, is that to get refugee status, you have to have some sort of an office there where you can apply, and we don't have that all over. And our asylum law recognizes that you may not have any way to seek asylum until you get here. And we have let people in for many, many years. For example, after the Haitian earthquake, we let a lot of Haitians in and allowed them to seek some form of protected status because of what had happened. We didn't have boots on the ground or offices that they could apply for status when that crisis happened, and we couldn't get it down there fast enough. But once they got here, it was like, well, okay, yes, you do have a good case. So it's often been used that way, just recognizing that we can't be everywhere providing orderly pathways for all these things. But if people show up at our border and they have a good case, we ought to take that into account because we've signed on to those international laws and we have our own.
Kat, Tim Lake, I have a non-border immigration question. In the early 80s, I worked for a system of Montessori preschools, and we brought in teachers from Sri Lanka. And I knew at the time I was involved with immigration, and there was a quota, certain number of people from different countries you could bring in every year. My question is the country able to loosen the spigot on those quotas and able to help fill the need for labor that we so desperately have in this country?
I think that's one of the best things that immigration reform could do, because the current number of visas that we give out in different labor categories is ridiculously low compared to the number of workers that our economy can productively absorb. So thank you for asking that question. That's one of my biggest ideas for how to fix this, is to make the number of visas that we give out in line with what we can productively use in this country. And it's going to fluctuate up and down depending on circumstances, and I think that's okay. But right now, people will come if they know they can get a job here. It's hard to stop them. And if there aren't jobs here, they'll go away, just like they did after the Great Recession. They knew there weren't jobs. They went home. Another place I'd like to see us give more visas is for students. We have been reducing the number of visas we give to foreign students, which is crazy on two fronts. One is that many of our colleges and universities, the only people who pay full freight are foreign students. They're very important economically to a lot of institutions of higher education. And another piece is that it's good soft power to have lots of people have come here, and also many of them want to stay, and they're highly skilled and they're highly entrepreneurial, and they create a crazy percentage of the new companies and new jobs that get created. So they're a triple win for the United States, and it's a self-inflicted wound to reduce the number of them who come here.
And perhaps if I may just add one comment, because you mentioned the H-1B visa, which is again tied to your answer. So for a very long time, for decades, right, the US had a H-1B visa limit, I think, of 65,000 visas for highly skilled workers. Many corporations have said for a long time, this is way, way too low. Why don't we want to have talent that comes to this country? And even despite many politicians, right, saying, yeah, let's try it, we still haven't been able to come up with the reform to change the system. So it's kind of really strange. Yeah.
Hello, thank you again for the presentation. It was really informative. And I'm Sedef. I'm an assistant professor in political science department here. I do have like two questions. One, is there any ongoing policy or action from the government to basically target these transnational actors smuggling people to the border? And what are the challenges of that? And the other one, one of the factors that attract people, particularly from like Asian countries like Turkey, China, is that some Central American countries don't have visa requirements for these countries, so they can easily come and then make their way to the U.S. Is there any conversation or some kind of policy between the U.S. government and these governments about like changing their visa policies toward these countries' nationals, basically?
I wish I had a better answer for you on the first one. I'm sure that we have lots of people working on smuggling because it's a big international crime thing. It's not a subject that I've looked into a lot, but I know that there's a lot of concern about it. Regarding the free visa requirements, I think some of the countries that do that are kind of sticking it to the United States deliberately, and they're not countries that are going to do us any favors. One of them is Nicaragua. Cubans can travel visa-free to Nicaragua, and then they can travel overland from there. So it's a very easy way for Cubans to get out. And I think there's Colombia may be one of them that will take people from all over the world without visas. And Colombia only sometimes accepts deportation flights from the United States. We don't have a bad relationship with them, but it's a little testy on the subject of migration. So I don't know how far we would get with that. I think that the countries that we can work with are certainly Mexico is doing a lot, although I have quite a bit of discomfort over some of what we're asking them to do and that they are doing. But yeah, I think there are some countries that it's within their interests to work with us and others that are not. Our efforts with Panama have not borne fruit very well, partly because it's not really in Panama's overall diplomatic interests to please us as opposed to some other people. They've got other fish to fry, so it hasn't been very effective what we've tried to do with them.
I'm Paul Schufs. I'm an economist. I have a comment and then an unrelated question after that too. A comment relates to some of the facts you mentioned about the number of immigrants who've come in the recent few years, many of them legally and others we know have not come in legally. But whichever way they came in, they have been a very important part of the big rebound from the short recession that we had right after the pandemic. If you've been following the economic news, you know that we've have significant economic growth now, and quite a significant part of that has been jobs filled by immigrants. We would not have had nearly that kind of an economic rebound without the number of immigrants that did come in.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And in fact, a lot of people think that one of the reasons that our economy has outperformed so many other economies has been the active immigration in the last few years.
Right.
And all you have to do is ask a Wisconsin dairy farmer what they think of immigration law if you want to hear a rant. They're very frustrated that they could lose their workers if we start deporting people or making it harder to get them in. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that.
Sure, and the question unrelated to that is, I'm curious, we know that Mexico has a new president just within, recent months, I guess it is. Is there any indication that she is going to be cooperating more or less or helping to facilitate, the border crossings issues that Mexico and the U.S. have been struggling with, for so long?
She seems to be pretty much a candidate of sticking to the same path as Manuel López Obrador. I wouldn't expect big changes from her. So far, she hasn't made signals about them. And we do pay Mexico to do the things we want it to do. They've done lots of different things. I mean, they allowed the migrant camps under the migrant protection protocols. They put up with it. There have been times when we've helped pay for them to speed up their freight trains so people can't climb on them. We've paid to have more enforcement to keep people from getting on freight trains and riding north. We've done all kinds of things with Mexico to try to reduce the flow of people. We've paid them to keep their southern border more guarded and to not give out transit visas to cross Mexico to get to the US, all sorts of measures. And I suspect that we're just going to continue to negotiate those sorts of measures with the current president, the new president. It's still AMLO.
Doug Northrop. I gather immigration is not a peculiar problem for the United States, but is more of a worldwide problem. Is there anything we can learn from what's going on in Europe or elsewhere?
Boy, that's a great question. I think that an awful lot of countries are really struggling with it, but let me show you one slide. This is not part of my show, but I'm going to show it to you anyway. This one, foreign-born population compared with that of other countries. So the first list is countries that are similar to the US that have 11 to 15% foreign-born. They include the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Spain, the Netherlands, and Norway. I think that's a nice club to belong to. Those are all prosperous, democratic, basically well-run countries, and they're handling that level of foreign-born populations quite well. And then there's countries with more foreign-born, 16 to 43%. That list includes Sweden, Ireland, Austria, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Israel, Switzerland, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Well, gosh, with the exception of Singapore, those are also pretty much democracies that there's a lot to like about those countries, and they manage to host a lot of people successfully. So I'm interested in the countries that have managed to resettle large numbers of immigrants very successfully. I think Canada is one of the great ones. Canada is amazing. I was there a couple of years ago visiting friends, and I went to a party where I don't think there were more than 3 people from any one country, and nobody was from Canada. There was one family from Canada, but they were all just in this amazing, peaceful, happy community of people that was getting along. I mean, it was really remarkable. And they're from all over the world. It's not just one region, they're from everywhere, and it's working really well. So that, to me, is one of the best examples, is just the existence of countries that accommodate even more foreign-born than we have, in some cases by large margins, and they make it work. It is possible. And I will say that I think our refugee settlement system has some things to recommend it that other countries don't necessarily have. Our system does rely more on volunteers. It relies more on ordinary citizens to help resettle refugees, and there aren't enough of us. I mean, Tim Light can tell you, there are plenty of families that come and don't get a welcome group. But the ones who do have a leg up into this new country, this new society, that very few governments give by just giving government aid. But the government aid works well, too. I mean, Canada has found it to be in their interests to actively recruit immigrants and pay for them until they can get on their feet, because it does so much for the economy. They pay for it.
We also love questions from students, if there are any questions.
Can you talk about what our government does for migrants? Because there's an awful lot of, I believe, misconceptions. And you mentioned that, so if you would briefly go over, what does the U.S. government actually do besides turn them over to charities?
Well, it depends on what category of migrant they are. If they're refugees, last I knew, they get $940 one lump sum payment when they arrive. They also have to pay the government back for their plane ticket here, so they actually arrive in debt. And out of that $940, they have to, buy a bed and, stuff to furnish an apartment. And then they are given medical services. Obviously, they go to school if they're kids. They're given, I guess they're pretty much routinely signed up for Medicaid in Wisconsin, but they don't get much else, actually. The agencies that help integrate them and support them are funded for a few months. There are 3 months worth of services for each one. Every migrant who comes in, or refugee who comes in, has 3 months worth of services and a little bit after that. It's a very bare bones budget, very bare bones. We don't give them much at all. If they come in as asylum seekers and they have crossed the border undocumented, they get nothing, absolutely nothing. They can go to food pantries, they can go private charity, but they don't get anything from the government. After 6 months, they can apply for a work permit, and that's usually not a big hassle to get. That system seems to work reasonably well. And then they can start working and supporting themselves, but they get no government support. One of the migrants that I know, one of the asylum seekers that I know, had a baby, and the baby qualified for WIC, Women, Infants, and Children. That was the only thing that she qualified for. So I haven't met migrants getting all sorts of government services. I will also say that particular one accessed some things. They weren't federal. She accessed a program that was established for mothers of young children trying to get their HSED. And she got her HSED. But that wasn't a federal program. That was just a local program that happened to exist, and they accepted her as an asylum seeker because, well, why not? She wanted to get her HSED, and she did. So she went through there. So there was a local program like that, but it wasn't any guarantee. If she'd lived in another city, she might not have gotten that.
So you said they pay their plane ticket. So if they're a refugee, you pay their plane ticket?
No, we don't. They have to pay. The government will give them a plane ticket, I guess, but then they have to pay it back over a series of months. They have to pay it back, and usually the ticket is more than the $940. So refugees, even refugees, arrive kind of in debt.
We have time for one or two last questions. Anybody else?
So from what you just said, Kat, the biggest drain on the taxpayer, and it would be state and local, would be the children. It's the education for the children, educating them to be productive, tax-paying citizens.
Yes, that is, I think it's a political issue and a financial issue that we haven't addressed as a nation, because if you look at the statistics on the economic productivity of immigrants and their contributions, including undocumented ones, you see that they're a net gain. They pay more in taxes than they take in services, and that's true. It's also true for refugees. Actually, the federal government just did a study on that, and they found even for refugees who are not chosen because they're economically productive, they're chosen specifically because they're very vulnerable, even they are a net positive. However, oh shoot, where was I going? Remind me.
Children.
Oh, children, yes. The cost of educating children falls to a level of government that doesn't necessarily see all of the benefits immediately from, schools can struggle with what it takes to educate immigrant children. It can be a big expense. But let me give you an example of a community that decided to, well, they didn't decide, this happened to them. There was a community in Iowa, I think it was called Postville, and they had a meat packing plant. It was a kosher meat packing plant. And one day there was an immigration raid, and they arrested a whole bunch of undocumented workers at this plant. And what ended up happening was, first, they couldn't get workers to replace them, and the plant shut down. When the plant shut down, all the management families also lost their jobs, and so they left town, And one of the immediate results was that a private Jewish school closed. And then the bottom dropped out of the housing market because so many people left. And all of a sudden, even the people who stayed, their houses weren't worth what they had been. And then the school lost a whole ton of kids, so they lost state aids. I mean, this cascading series of catastrophes because there was an immigration raid that took a bunch of undocumented workers out. So you can say there are costs, and there can be. I've experienced it. I taught in the high school. I've worked with English language learner students, and I get that it's challenging and it takes extra resources. But when I look at what we get in the big picture, oh boy, is it worth it.
This will be our last question.
Hi, Kat. I'm Amory Ewert, and I'm just wondering, I guess, for application here for us locally even, do you have any numbers or information on people that are settling here in the area, either even in Ripon or in Fond du Lac County? Are you able to give any information on that, or what opportunities we might have to assist with that?
Sure. I can tell you a little bit. I would say that immigration in Ripon is kind of at a trickle. It's not a lot. There was a whole lot of it in the late 1990s, just before 9/11. There was quite a bit, and then kind of slammed the door on that for a while. In Fond du Lac as a whole, in the county, there's definitely more. I know some of one of the elementary schools, Chegwin in Fond du Lac, has a high population of foreign-born kids, or at least their parents are foreign-born. And I've heard from the chief of police there that there are a lot of Ecuadorians. That's been a recent surge as a country, ascending country, because there's been so much political and gang violence there. So I know there's more Ecuadorians arriving. If you're interested in helping out with asylum seekers or migrants more generally, I would say one place to go would be Holy Family Church. They do support several migrant families, asylum-seeking families, and some of the local charities also are seeing a lot of migrants. We could talk afterwards if you like. I might have a slide for that, but yeah. So yeah, there are ways to plug in and help folks out, and there's also higher level. There's also an effort. Voces de la Frontera is another organization. So yeah, there's a few options.
We do have one more question.
Chris Schumacher, Director of Athletics. I don't have a question. I just want to say thank you. It was very refreshing to listen to an informed conversation.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your questions.
Well. Yes, thank you very much, Kat. And I loved at the end we had a local focus and we had a beautiful final comment. And thank you also for coming tonight and supporting our programming. Let me just quickly announce the next program. We'll take a break for a couple of weeks and then we'll go into election season. October 25th, we'll have a Wisconsin All-Star panel here in Ripon. We'll have Charlie Sykes, who is, of course, a well-known political commentator. We'll also have Emily Fannin, she's at CBS 58. And we have Craig Gilbert, who is the former Washington bureau chief of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. It'll be an event at 6 p.m. Friday night, and the location we still have to determine next few days because I realize how important audio is. So we'll make an announcement the next couple of days. We'll also, by the way, have a post-election panel. That'll be a discussion full of students. So we'll see sort of students' reaction to the election results, and of course we'll make an announcement about that. So, Kat, thank you one more time. Thank you for coming, and have a good night.